Hi, and welcome again to my channel, Jayla Bombadi Si Jamila Orior, and I'm back again with the second part of Chapter 7 of Drug, the Science and Culture Behind Psychotropic Drugs, to its writer, J. Arthur Miller. And the title of this chapter was Harry and Tonto, not Harry and Toronto, as I said in the first part. Uh, I had Toronto on my mind. So, in this part, I will go over some points of the previous parts, and then I include some points that I thought and I think are important to dwell on, and I searched on my own. So let's go over what we have seen and what I'm going to talk about before I tackle the second part of chapter 7. In the first part, we talked about hemp, right? The plant cannabis, as identified in the world of botany, and classified in three types: cannabis sativa, cannabis rhodiolis, and cannabis indica. We have seen how Americans were mandated to grow hemp and how Benjamin Franklin himself had a plantation for hemp, and that the Declaration of Independence was written on paper made of the hemp plant. They grew the hemp plant for various reasons and for many uses, such as uh, uh, manufacturing cloth, paper, and rope for shipping. Uh, we have seen how that all of that and that cannabis, as we know it, have become an issue only with its recreational use. As has been introduced to North America by Mexican immigration, according to what's been reported in the book and according to Harry Anslinger, the supremacist, and through the south and southeast. Mexican immigrants got to other parts of the United States, and so did their national habits, according to Harry Anslinger, who thought Mexican recreational use of marijuana was or their national habits was what had the habit spread to other communities of less privileged constituents, such as jazz Negroes, and of course the ones who hanged out with them. And that was a threat to white Christian Europeans' morality and blood. That is how he launched his war, according to the author, for racial purity and against people with weaker genes who put the Nordic whites at risk of racial contamination. And this was also in other, you can get from other sources also. His supremacist views were invigorated by the eugenic Leckard office in Cold Spring Harbor, led by trusted white scientists such as Charles Davenport and Harry H. Laughlin. Harry and Slingers venerated those guys since they were giving him the right science based argument to have confidence in his supremacist racial views. They used their pseudoscience evidence based arguments to convince Congress pass sterilization laws. Many states adopted them and enforced them. Harry's enthusiasm got more invigorated by hearing news that his heroes inspired the German Chancellor Hitler to pass sterilization laws and also launch war for the supremacy of the Aryan race. Um, Here is what one should know about eugenics and a eugenic record office. The ERO, or Eugenic Record Office, is a research institute, that's how it started, that collected biological data and social biological data about American population for human heredity studies. They were inspired by the Mendelian inheritance studies. In reference to Gregor John Mendel, 19th century Moravian monk, who ran a hybridization experiment on pea plants. The experiment was on plants and vegetables, blending traits in one progeny. It took a large samples of pea plants and then hybridized that all in in one sample of progeny. So his study surveyed a large sample, as I said, of peas. He was the first to coin the word alleles and genes, and that you will see when you study genetics. He's credited for establishing the foundation for the science of genetics. His studies were run on plants only and were not verified on humans. So that's something else. Now, they were also influenced by Darwin's theory of evolution and principle of natural selection. They concluded erroneously, they just read these research papers and studied those books, and they concluded wrongfully that Nordic whites had the best genes and destined, therefore, to lead, and that for society to be strong, it has to get rid of that which is a hindrance in its way to continuity. The weak and debilitated, the disobedient, the sick, epileptics, mentally sick, and they said even seafarers, and all the ones of questionable morals or weaker genes had to be institutionalized in colonies for the epileptic and feeble-minded, and had also to be sterilized so they would not jeopardize the continuity of white supremacy. The case of Bucks versus Bell in 1927 is described as the landmark in U.S. Supreme Court case that established the constitutionality. They make it constitutional. They adopted the law in 1924, but in 1927, with this case, they make it like it's a truth now. It's a precedent we can base on. So they make it constitutional to sterilize the unfit. The decision was almost unanimous and was delivered by Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, who was quoted to have said that 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. And that's in talking why he would allow to sterilize that woman we are talking about. This case was the first litigation against the law, but ended up upholding it. It happened in Virginia, where Carrie Buck, and this was a white woman, Carrie Buck was ordered to comply by sterilization laws as she was viewed morally unfit. Had a child out of wedlock, was incarcerated in Virginia State Colony for the epileptic and feeble-minded. The doctor of the institution, cleverly enough, presented a claim for courts to allow him to sterilize Carrie. He filed a claim with the courts for her sterilization. Her adopting family had her incarcerated for an illegitimate pregnancy. And then when I searched it, they said she was adopted because her mother also was incarcerated because she had 3 children of unknown paternity. So, and then the woman was adopted, but the adopting family traveled and left her with a nephew. And then after that, she became pregnant, and they said she was raped. But that didn't concern the courts. She had an illegitimate child. They do not go after the guy. So her mother had 3 children, as I said, with unknown paternity, and had the mind of a child. That's what the doctor said. She was 6th grade. She's at the 6th grade. at the time. The court ruled in favor of her sterilization. The Virginia laws of sterilization were not repealed until 1974, and the state of Virginia did not issue an apology until 2002. The sterilization laws were adopted by 32 states, and 60,000 sterilizations were performed on American people that were deemed a danger to societal genetic pool. And then let's just um, be frank with ourselves, because they said the Nordic white had the best genes and listened to rules, so all the others that were feeble-minded, were of lower standard, weaker genes, were a threat to the societal genetic pool. Now, all of this was mentioned in the book, but it alluded briefly to some and talked extensively about other points. Harry's campaign was legitimate back then and was upheld by laws he fervently helped happen. His campaign against marijuana also resulted in the birth of very strict laws against the smuggling, growing, dealing, and handling of marijuana, as we will see in the second part. If we consider all this under an objective light, we might have a somehow different perspective. Genetics has been started as an experiment on plants, vegetables, with the aim to verify how would a miscegenation improve or worsen the progeny. This was happening even at the level of animal stock. The chromosome theory and modern genetics that sprang from Mendel's hybridization experiment helped and still aims at helping the discontinuity of certain hereditary genes, such as those for diabetes, for example. This was what gave rise to the genome bank, right? Or the bank, and an unimaginable number of genomes and DNA database sequence of all kinds of people, including humans. This is pure science. Applying such experiments on human and deducting that hybridization or bastardization is a threat on the Nordic white pool was pure pseudoscience and racism. Charles Davenport founded the International Federation of Eugenic Organization in 1925. It aimed at creating a world map of miscegenation areas with the help of Eugene Fisher as the chairman of the Commission on Bastardization and Miscegenation in 1927. Now, for some reason, I feel like from the word bastardization, because it's kind of used as an insult, but here it's just like mixing two different genomes in one being. That's like messing up with the integrity of that person's genome. So he presented a book on race crossing in Jamaica as an attempt to provide statistical evidence for biological degradation following interbreeding between whites and blacks. He was accused of science, racism, and classism. The war on cannabis was among other wars on psychedelics and illegal trafficking and use, but this gave people who harbored fanatic supremacist beliefs such as Harry Anslinger the right pretext to justify the righteousness of his racist beliefs. This was not expressed in the book, but my own opinion. I am not and was never for legalization of smoking hashish or marijuana. Hashish is like a psychedelic thing, and marijuana, I don't know, but still it's smoking anything. Anything you smoke jeopardizes your health. Anything. And this is has been proven beyond any reasonable doubt scientifically that is bad for the health, and also psychedelic and psych effects can cloud a person's judgment. As for the legalization of its medicinal use, such as in pills, tablets, ointment, that has already been on the market for quite long, and we will see in the second part of this chapter. Uh, Now let's talk about the second part. Let's start with section cannabis and West. That's where I stopped. So, actual encounter with the drug and its properties occurred with European exploration and travels to Asian territories, where hashish was used. Prior to such contact, it was all witchcraft and legends. Garcia de Horta, a Portuguese Marano doctor, and we have seen a Marano. It's used for somebody who is Jewish, and then adopts another religion without hides his Jewish belief and converts to another religion for fear not being of being persecuted. So this doctor, he's also Marano. He traveled to Goa in 1534 and wrote colloquies on the simples and drugs and medicinal matters of India and of a few fruits. He included facts about the effects and use of hashish, opium, datura. He described the psychoactive effects and how hashish causes fatuous euphoria, aphrodisiac, and hypnotic effect. And as we have seen, even Shannon, thousand years earlier, came to the same effect and said if you consume it in excess, you'll see demons, which was a reference to hallucinations or psychedelic effects. His book became known in Europe and sparked experimentation and use of cannabis. The Spanish Inquisition found out that he was secretly Jewish of faith and burned his books except for one copy that was spared and was translated to many languages. The discovery of tobacco influenced and ignited the habit of smoking and using cannabis in America. It became even wider in Europe. Smoking became the first step to rolling in all kinds of cannabis in joints with tobacco. The Middle East was reintroduced to cannabis and tobacco smoking joints. Culturally, the Romantic movement in the 18th century and 19th century was influenced by European fascination with all that is Oriental, which affected the Art Nouveau or late Romantic movement. Napoleon was defeated in Egypt by the British, and his soldiers brought back the cannabis habit to France after they had been trapped in Egypt with no access to alcohol. The author said they couldn't have access to alcohol because Egypt was Muslim, but to be honest, alcohol has always been there. It just they were also introduced to that, or that's all they could lay their hands on. Cannabis drew the attention of psychopharmacology. Jacques Joseph Moreau, a Parisian doctor in the 19th century with interest in the disease of the mind, concluded after self-experimenting with various substances, cannabis included, that under the influence a person behaved in a similar way a mentally ill does. So this person started to take it a different level. He is viewing it from a different perspective. He's comparing the use of psychedelic to mental illness, the effects that psychedelics produce elicit in a person to mental illness. And this is not the first time we've seen that. We've seen that when we're talking about psychoactive, about psychotropic and antipsychotics. And now he wrote this book of hashish and mental derangement. It's a book where he discussed such ideas The book was actually the first to allude to neurochemistry as a key to psychiatric dysfunctionality. So the book in French, Du hashish et l'aliénation mentale, études psychotropiques, published in 1845. He concluded that in doses as high as 16 grams or higher, the following list of intoxication symptoms. Now we have seen that Garcia de Horta, Shandong, thousand years ago, and now we see in 19th century this French doctor also explaining the psychoactive effect or psychedelic effect. He said that when you consume uh, like a dose as high as 16 grams, a person have general feeling of pleasure, increased excitement combined with heightening of all senses, distortion of dimensions and of space and time, a keener sense of hearing combined with greater susceptibility to music, and the phenomenon that ordinary noise can be enjoyed as it sounded sweet. Five, the fifth point he also addressed, persistent ideas verging on persecution and mania. Disturbance, six, disturbance of emotion, most often an increase in pre-existing feelings. Seven, irresistible impulses. Eight, illusions and hallucinations, of which evidently only the latter is related to objects of the external world. So this is obvious, this is direct, not just allusion. It's like stating the psychedelic effect of smoking of marijuana and hashish, or taking it. Morrow included a clique of his in the experiments. That was how the Club of Hashashin was founded. Uh, Theophile, Theophile Gautier, the one for art's sake, and the Parisian Bohemian author was a member of this group. The club experimented with mind-altering substances including dawamisk, which is a North African uh, psychedelic portion, a green paste of hashish combined with marzipan and other spices and little Spanish fly. It allowed them to act aphrodisiac. It is edible. Not, so this is again this agrees with what Helen Slinger advanced, that it makes people become very erotic and aphrodisiac and cannot control their sexual instincts and might even rape other people. So it's here he said it's aphrodisiac. No, I have no way to verify that, and I am not hashish or marijuana smoker, but the experiment was not very extensive, but still he agreed with others. So if people like from the 20th, from 19th century, agree with people thousands and thousands of years ago, and then other people, then there is some truth to that. Now, Baudelaire, De Quincey, Alexander Dumas were famous members of this Hashashin group. Bohemian and artists of England got swept by the same wave of experimenting with drugs. UK also developed interest in the pharmaceutical potential of cannabis. Now, the Irish doctor William Brooke Shaughnessy ran multiple well-controlled experiments on humans and animals. He concluded that cannabis was not dangerous and had a therapeutic potential as anticonvulsant, analgesic, and sedative. He published his paper in UK and USA. He brought a large supply of cannabis with him to England, where when he returned from India, when he had worked for the East Indian Company, his friend, the pharmacist Peter Squire, prepared a tincture out of cannabis that was marketed as square's extract. The medicinal use of cannabis were lauded and endorsed by authorities in the medical field, such as the Lancet, of this square extract. Now, Queen Victoria took some and was reported to have gotten amused. Many patented medications included cannabis, chlorodyne, for example, included both a tincture of cannabis and laudanum. They combined both tincture of laudanum, of cannabis and laudanum, and chloroform, a combo that advertised as a treatment for cholera, pain, diarrhea, insomnia, neuralgia, migraines, and many other things. Actually, it sedated, relieved pain and diarrhea. We know why. It has laudanum and it has chloroform, so it's sedated, and it has cannabis, so it's sedated. It relieved pain because the person is no longer aware of that. Laudanum was also a painkiller. Opioids are still used as painkillers. And then it relieved diarrhea because all these cause constipation. As for cholera and neuralgia, migraine it can also relieve the pain. It was sold in the British Isles, in US by Eli Lilly, Scoop and others. It was listed in the United States Pharmacopoeia, marketed as non-addictive and swapped for opiates. Now see, it says non-addictive, it has laudanum in it. Cannabis tinctures and synthetic took US and its nascent pharmaceutical industry by swarms. It became mainly recreational in the 20th century because of its classification. The interest in hemp's pharmaceutical interest and therapeutic benefit has been resurrected in the 21st century, and we've heard all about those debates. Now let's talk about the kid from the pouch Gypsies. In this section, we take a step back to the 19th century as the author introduces us to Fitchburg Ludlow from Poughkeepsie in New York, who loved to self-experiment with drugs at the lab of his chemist of friend, or a chemist he befriended. He tried cannabis tinctures and experienced vivid hallucinations and visions. He said radical change of perception. That's what he experienced and described. He took the substance throughout high school and college and wrote articles about it, such as The Apocalypse of Hashish. He claimed Pythagoras and his disciples took cannabis. He wrote an autobiography, The Hashish Eater, being passages from the lives of Pythagorean. It was published in 1857. Obviously, the book was influenced by De Quincey's Confessions of an Opium Eater. We have talked about that when we talked about opiates. The illustrations were his friends Albert Bierstadt, a romantic painter of the 19th century. They went on a tour together. His wife ended up leaving him for Bierstadt. He died a few years later after having been sick for quite a while. So cannabis influenced the Romantic movement in Europe. The Parisian Bohemians found an echo in the aesthetic movement in England. Rossetti, remember Rossetti, the guy whose wife overdosed on laudanum? He was a painter, a romantic painter. His sister wrote that epic about laudanum and the bad habits it was and how it ended up killing people. Oscar Wilde and Yeats were part of such trend. Spiritualism and seances also rose and were held by the rich and famous. Organizations such as the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn had William Butler Yeats Aleister Crowley as member, the latter was self-declared prophet of the New Age. Bohemianism, paganism, spiritualism, witchcraft, and pantheism circles teemed with people who relied on psychedelics, psychotropics, quote, quote, or slash psychotropic that included cannabis. Now let's talk about the purification of hemp. 19th century has been has seen the isolation of many alkaloids from natural sources: morphine, strychnine, quinine, cocaine, and others. Mid 19th century had known the first attempt to isolate and purify the chemically psychoactive agents. Cannabis sativa and had alkaloids, but were not the ones that triggered a psychotropic effect. The word psychotropic is the author's. I'm not saying that. He didn't say the psychedelic effect, he says the psychotropic effect. If you read the book carefully, you would know somehow he's for the use such use. Alcoholic extracts were prepared in 1840s. The resinous substance after evaporation manifested biological activity. He didn't say psychedelic activity or anything else. He said biological activity. Chemists believed the resins were pure extracts and labeled them cannabins and hashishin. Now, two-thirds of a grain of such extracts can produce a potent narcotic effect, while one grain results in complete intoxications. Again, we're exposed to the intoxicating and inebriation effect that these substances can produce in a person. Now, yet, those were not actual pure extracts. Researchers from Cambridge University got what they believed to be pure extract. They used ether extracts of potent charas, uh, an Indian type of hashish, using distillation. Among many fractions, they got a red ruby oil, out of which they got substance they deemed to be pure psychotropic agents. They labeled it, or they labeled this agent as cannabinol. The chemical structure is C21H26O2. So it has carbon, it has hydrogen, it has oxygen. The structure does not have a nitrogen in it, so it confirmed the suspicion that it was not an alkaloid. This was the first of many cannabinoids yet to be discovered. Following the isolation and clarifications of the molecular structure of cannabinol, complete synthesis was possible. It was not until 1964 that the Israeli chemist Raphael Mechulam uh, isolated delta 9 tetrahydrocannabinol, or delta 9 THC, from C. sativa and other cannabinoids. Cannabidiol included, that proved to be the major active chemicals. Now let's talk about the cannabinoid receptors and their agonists. Researchers followed the same method used in opiates research to figure out the mechanism of action of cannabinoids: purification of the active ingredients first, then identification of the receptors, and the identification of natural ligand for the receptors, the endogenous ones. Similar to what the author introduced in previous chapters, morphine and codeine, for example, were isolated from opium, and opiate receptors in the body were identified, which led to the identification of endogenous opiates: beta endorphin, diendorphin, leukenkephalin, methenkephalin, known collectively as endorphins. The isolation of delta 9 THC opened the gate to many synthetic and semi synthetic derivatives. Investigative efforts aimed at finding among these analogs a therapeutic agent without the psychoactive effects of component of delta 9 tetrahydrocannabinol, just like what they did with the opiate. Aside from the psychotropic effects, cannabis has therapeutic effects, as has been described, such as analgesics, calming, and hypnotic, anti-emetic, appetite stimulant, anti-inflammatory, and decrease intraocular pressure associated with glaucoma. Delta 9 tetrahydrocannabinol, or delta 9 THC, mechanism of action had to be understood. It is a highly lipophilic molecule, so some believe that it could dissolve directly or cross the cell membrane even if no ligand, ion channels, or GPCRs, true proteins receptors, existed. This belief was tossed away or tossed aside later. Some cannabinoids proved to be stereoselective, such as the positive and negative effects of morphine. If you remember the mirror things we've talked about, delta THC 9 THC also inhibited electrically stimulated contraction of guinea pig, just like what opium or more opiate did. But the inhibition was not reversed with opiate antagonist naloxone. When they applied naloxone, it did not inhibit the stimulation of the contraction that was stimulated by delta 9 tetrahydrocannabinol. They concluded it interacted with non-opiate receptors. It has its own receptors. In 1980s, researchers found out that delta 9 THC had a GPCR. They applied delta 9 THC to neuronal cells. The enzyme adenyl cyclase was inhibited. It is a very important enzyme in cell signaling and the production of cyclic AMP. Receptor binding bioassays in preparations such as PERS and Snyder's to confirm the existence of cannabinoid receptors were not so suitable for an irradiated delta 9 THC because it's lipophilic and they couldn't visualize it better. Pharmaceutical companies were synthesizing potent cannabinoids. So Pfizer synthesized a very powerful compound labeled CP55940 in 1990. When irradiated and used in bioassays experiment, it revealed the actual GPCR. The GPCR was cloned, were synthesized after its amino acid sequence had been identified. They dissected it, identified its sequence, amino acid sequence, and had been identified and labeled as CB1 or cannabinoid 1. A second receptor was also identified and also cloned and became CB2. So these were the receptors. CB1 is widely distributed in the brain and also in the pancreas, the liver, the lungs, and the gut. CB2 receptors are rare in the brain, but high in tissue of the immune system. Now that the receptors for cannabinoids are identified, what are the endogenous molecules we have in the body that interact with such receptors? Those receptors were there before we introduced delta 9 THC. So what were they interacting with? Finding out about endorphins, endogenous opiates, helps scientists understand one fact: the endogenous molecule does not have to be structurally, chemically similar to what we introduce to the body. So they have to pay that very particular attention to that fact. The search for the endocannabinoids started. Raphael Mechoulam and his colleagues from Hebrew University identified the molecule. They used CB1 receptors that was labeled by a radioactive agonist. The cells were from the brain. They observed for any molecule that would compete with the radioactive substance for CB1 receptors. The indigenous substance was revealed. It was arachidonyl ethanol amide, that is also known as AEA. Helped with scientists from Scotland, they used isolated nerve cells bioassays and observed how electrically stimulated contraction were inhibited when arachidonyl ethanol amide is applied. Unlike enkephalin, the contraction were not reversed with naloxone. They baptized the molecule as Ananda, which means bliss in Sanskrit. Soon they isolated another endogenous cannabinoid, 2-arachidonyl glycerol or 2-AG, and many others were found in the nervous system and other systems. Endocannabinoids are derived from arachidonic acid, and so are many other messenger molecules. Arachidonic acid is a polyunsaturated fatty acid, or PUFA, found in the cell membrane in position 1 and 2 in the glycerol molecule. The enzymes phospholipase the enzymes phospholipases catalyze the activity of polyunsaturated fatty acid and arachidonic acid that can become transformed into eicosanoids, molecule messengers important in cell signaling. They are part of the same pathway that include prostaglandin, prostacyclin, thromboxane, and leukotriene. These have specific GPCRs and sometimes act on other receptors, such as PPAR gamma, which is peroxisome proliferated activated gamma receptors. The latter exists within the cell, a nuclear ligand ion receptor that regulates adipocyte differentiation, glucose, and inflammation. Eicosanoids play a role in generating inflammation response. The author wants to say that similar to aspirin that generates anti-inflammatory response by acting on prostaglandin, and John Vane was Nobel Prize for this discovery. Eicosanoids, Ananda 2 arachidonyl, and glycerol could be added to AA derived molecules that play such a role. Arachidonic acid molecules that play such a role. Endocannabinoids and neurotransmission. The focus on CB1 receptors because it is most abundant in the brain, and delta 9 tetrahydrocannabinol, which is a psychoactive drug, the pure extracts of C. sativa, and have the psychoactive agents get to the brain, and its receptor is CB1. Now, are endocannabinoids neurotransmitters? Endorphin and enkephalin are endogenous opiates because they're produced in the presynaptic neurons, stored in the synaptic vesicles, and released upon calcium influx into presynaptic terminals. Endocannabinoids are a little different. They do not follow the same rules. They are produced on demand as needed, produced in the postsynaptic neuron instead of presynaptic neuron. Upon calcium increase also, they are not stored in vesicles, they diffuse backwards to act on CB1 and to have the action that's supposed to happen. they act on CB1 receptors in presynaptic terminals. So the author said, and I agree with him, they could be labeled as retrograde neurotransmitters, to quote the author. Now, it has been proven that endogenous cannabinoids are also neurotransmitter systems. Endogenous agonists, anandamide and 2-AG or 2-arachidonyl glycerol, and their receptors CB1 and CB2, and their biosynthetic and degradative enzyme. They also have their little lab in the brain, neurotransmission lab. So let's talk about the prescription on pot. Delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol drew the attention of the pharmaceutical industry to its therapeutic promise. That's what the author said, therapeutic promise. And then also, we do not have to forget that delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol is the pure extract for its the psychoactive agent, the pure psychoactive thing. Now, a very large number of cannabinoid drugs have been synthesized. They included CB1 and CB2 receptor agonists and antagonists, inhibitors of the enzymes that catalyze the degradation of anandamide and 2-arachidonyl glycerol, FAH and MAGL, fatty acid amide hydrolase and monoacyl glycerol lipase. Other synthesized drugs block the movement of endocannabinoids in and out of the cell. Marinol. Now we're introduced to some medications that were there quite a long time. Now, marinol, draminol is delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol in its pure form. This medication is delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol form that is marketed in US. It is prescribed as anti-emetic for cancer patient and appetite stimulants for AIDS patient. So these are there, but were prescription based, and there are others that were just there. You don't need prescriptions from. You didn't need that one. The laws that regulate drugs in USA has crude cannabis as Schedule 1. Now, when we talk about Schedule 1, cannabis is Schedule 1. It was, and it still is, they were talking about rude, and not rude, about crude marijuana, like the plant in its crude form, like take it from the field and then roll it and then sell it. That was the one that was criminalized, and it still is federally not legal. The law that regulates the USA, as I said, has crude cannabis as Schedule 1 that cannot be prescribed or sold for any reason. Marinol is the pure preparation of delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol in sesame oil. They just take that pure extract and place it in sesame oil or sesame oil capsules. No other cannabinoids such as cannabidiol associated with marijuana or hashish, just delta tetrahydrocannabinol. Sesamet, nabilone is a synthetic derivative of delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, and it's CB1 and CB1 antagonist prescribed. Did I say antagonist? Agonist, and it's prescribed for nausea and recently for neuropathic pain. Sativex sold in Europe and Canada for neuropathic pain and musculosclerosis and MS related spasticity. Sativex is extracted from C. sativa, It contains delta 9 tetrahydrocannabinol and cannabidiol, mostly other cannabinoids in hemp plants. Mostly all that is psychotropic active in all the other plants, and it is almost identical to natural marijuana. There are many drugs that were based on delta 9 tetrahydrocannabinol and others that were developed as endocannabinoid analogs. Now, not only the plants, they do not synthesize. Uh, when we say synthesize, it's not semi-synthesized. They 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 sequence the plant's chemistry. They know what it is, and they get out of out of scratch something new, but it's just fabricated in the lab. So now, even endocannabinoids, the one that our body produced, they had analogs, and this is not far-fetched. You know how we have epinephrine, we have all those things that we that are there out synthetic, but it's not from our bodies. So same thing here. Now, CB1 receptor agonist stimulates appetite, so CB1 antagonists would obviously stimulate satiety and would help with weight loss for people suffering from obesity. Rimonabant Acamplia was the answer. It was CB1 antagonist sold as weight loss miracle in Europe. Obesity being an issue in USA, so it got marketed in USA and actually did help with weight loss. The author said that many women got their Prada size, So, but caused depression, which was a major turnoff for the FDA, which pulled it off the market. Now, why did it cause depression? Because rimonabant blocks CB1, and in and outside the brain, because it crosses to the brain. So it blocks anything that's cannabinoid, whether produced by the body or introduced to the body, to limit appetite, to produce satiety. So obesity is a metabolism related disorder and can also include comorbidities such as diabetes and cardiovascular disorders. Or sometimes those disorders also produce such things. The brain constantly communicates with peripheral systems for metabolism, adipogenesis, muscle, and GI function. The endocannabinoid system in the peripheral system can be the key to controlling peripheral metabolism. CB1 antagonist that does not cross the brain could be the answer. The author says that many synthetic cannabinoids have been produced and some have been advertised as marijuana producing effects, yet they are legal. Now, spice and K2 are an example. Those are illicit drugs that are produced and that are marijuana or marijuana-like. For example, contain molecules synthesized by Dr. John Hoffman of Clemson University, and instead of marijuana hashish, instead of smoking those, they get spice and K2 and they get their high. Many other cannabinoids were synthesized and sold despite their psychoactive effects. Michelin, the guy who actually identified delta 9 tetrahydrocannabinol and was credited for that, produced Hue 210. Hue is Hebrew University, and Dash 210. All these have acquired designer drug status, similar to what happened with Shulgins, if you remember, who synthesized, lots of halogenics, theramine-based products. Now, how legal is all this? Let's see. Potent law That's the section that answers this question. World War II ended, but Harry Anslinger wars against marijuana, racial corruption, in addition to war against the emerging threat of communism, have not. Those wars ended, but his war have not ended. And he was responsible for the bureau that controls these things. So the Bugs Act of 1950 set very strict penalties. 1960s had known radical new pro-peace movement for whom marijuana and drugs became a generational statement. So lots of people were out there for those, the hippies, the other things, and and then the movement for pro peace and against Vietnam War, and and that had helped to change the Marijuana Act, which was bundled and was found unconstitutional. Marijuana Tax Act. It became the Controlled Substance Act. It got another vesture, uh, which categorizes uh, drugs in 5 schedules from 1 to 5. Marijuana was categorized as Schedule 1, which means, according to this act, it has no clinical merits whatsoever. And the talk here is about marijuana in its crude form. The author believes it was a political decision, and that those decisions were still influenced by Harry Anslinger and his mates' campaign. Marijuana was widespread. A new awareness of its therapeutic effect research, and the FBN, the Federal Bureau for Narcotics, became the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Agency, in 1967, and its campaign against marijuana got fiercer. Now, Congress created the Compassionate IND program between 1966 and 1988. I looked it up. It was created in 1978 in response to legal victories by a patient who was charged with possession of marijuana for treatment of glaucoma. The program was closed by the Bush administration in the 1990s. Official investigational committees have been started by European, British, and US government. Britain started its own investigation in 1893. The commission assigned the responsibility was the Indian Drugs Commission, aimed at the use of cannabis cultivation, its effect on users, and possible taxation or prohibition. They aimed at searching these facts about cannabis. Their conclusions were as follows: hemp was not dangerous, does not result in addiction or mental disorder, used religiously, and attempts to tax it or prohibit it might lead to civil unrest. Now, when they are talking about used religiously, obviously in the places they were colonizing, such as India, for example, and also because it benefited them a lot. Now, UK revisited the same question in 1960s in a commission led by Baroness Wooton, social scientist, and it concurred with the Indian Hemp Commission of the 19th century. The result investigation was no different than the previous result that the other committee have reached. The government thought that Wooten Committee was was a cannabis lobby. They were lobbying for cannabis. That's what. But this is not the author's opinion, of course. New York's Mayor's Committee on Marijuana in 1944 came to a similar conclusion as Wooten's. Long-term moderate marijuana use, this is the New York Commission in 1944, long-term moderate marijuana use does not cause addiction, and it does not cause any antisocial behavior or violent crimes or lead to mental disorders or psychotropic behaviors in otherwise normal people. That's the term we also need to pay attention to. In otherwise normal people. Normal people who consume it like responsibly do not get into such trouble. The U.S. Army also set a commission to investigate the smoking of marijuana habit of U.S. soldiers while stationed in Panama. Their findings were no different than the previous committee and commissions. 1970s, the Dutch investigative efforts had concluded that drugs can be categorized into very dangerous and less dangerous. Heroin is categorized, according to this Dutch investigation, as heroin is categorized as very dangerous, while marijuana comes second, which means it is similar to, we have scheduled in US from 1 to 5. So heroin, according to the investigation of the Dutch investigation, remains class schedule 1, very dangerous, no clinical benefits, and marijuana came schedule 2. And all these, when you talk about them schedules, they schedule them also according to addiction and danger on health. So anything that's schedule 2 is still very addictive. Anything that's schedule 3 is still addictive. Now, 1970s, the Dutch investigation, as I said, classified the substances into two categories, very dangerous and less dangerous. Heroin was, according to them, was categorized as very dangerous, and marijuana, according to them, was categorized, comes second after that. So, yet they did not legalize it, although they said, it's not that dangerous, but they did not legalize it. Since they were bound by international treaties and dictated that all signatories or signing parties are and were to maintain certain drugs illegal. Cannabis is included among these illegal drugs. The Dutch legal system shows some leniency towards those charged with the possession of small amounts. It is no longer a criminal offense but a misdemeanor. So the laws have become more lenient. Specifically, licensed cafes permitted marijuana sales and smoking while cultivation is still illegal. So this is really a predicament and a dilemma for people who what to do, know what to do with that. So they give licenses to cafes to allow them to sell marijuana and allow their customers to smoke it in those cafes, but it's still illegal. You cannot possess it out, and you cannot, and crude cannabis is still illegal all over. So now drug tourism, because of this in Netherlands, flourished, yet cannabis, no cannabis-induced crimes swept the country. That's what the author included. There are attempts to legalize marijuana possession in small amounts at the time of writing the book, and the book was he's talking about United States, and the book was written in 2012. The pharmacology potential of cannabis is yet to be explored, the author believes. So this is what we have here, and we'll talk about chapter 8 next time, and it talks about coffee, about coffee, and about tea, coffee, tea, and cigarettes. And I'll conclude on these terms and wish you all the best and stay cool. It's getting hotter here and outside, so it's we're today I think in the 80s. So let's see you next time. Have a good time and enjoy your life. Bye bye.